You're listening to the podcast Back to the Real, and I'm your host, Marcus Taylor. Welcome to the podcast Back to the Real. Today's guest is my good friend and colleague, Sophia Juul, and she's here today to talk about Zeitgeist. Okay, ready? Okay. Hey, Sophia.
Hello.
Hey, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Oh yeah. Tell me about, I can tell you about myself. So we work together. I'm a PhD student at Lund University. I study English linguistics. Yeah. But I think sort of the reason why I'm here today is that we've been talking about movies. And before I entered into university, I went to film school in LA for a short while.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
So we're going to talk a little bit about that today.
Absolutely, absolutely. Do you feel that you can combine something you learned from that time together with the studies you're doing now, the research?
It's a different way of writing.
Yeah.
But I think when you're trained to write, you recognize genres really well. So I think I use that in my work of writing academically, which is a completely different thing than writing
I can imagine.
Creatively.
Yeah. But cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. But I'm thinking since you're the guest here, it's the custom that the guest decides what they want to talk about. So my question to you is, what would you like to talk about today?
I would like to talk about this idea of Zeitgeist. Ways of being in the world through different generations. And I think that is very much reflective in the entertainment that we watch and in the movies that are produced. And we should just try to go back to, for me at least, I can't go further back than the 90s, but we can go back to the 90s and then talk about how it sort of has changed.
Yeah.
So one thing I really wanted to bring up today was this idea of naive optimism that I feel like encapsulates a lot of what we produced in the 90s, both TV shows and in terms of movies.
Sounds cool. So when you say Zeitgeist, are you thinking of a certain time? A certain
way of being in a generation.
Yeah.
The sort of streams, you could say, in sort of popular culture and sort of how that's reflected in the entertainment that we consume.
Yeah. I can remember being born in the 80s. Things that I grew up with, for example. It feels like lots have changed today. We're thinking about today's society as well, that what's accepted and what's not accepted, for example, to talk about or show in movies, for example. So I would say, that's very interesting. Let's explore that.
Let's explore. Where do we start?
Where do we start? Just on top of your mind, do you have an example that you were thinking about?
Rewatching it, because I do that all the time, rewatching Friends, which is sort of one of the TV shows that I grew up with. Rewatching it now in terms of sort of what it really is that they show, this group of friends, is relationships to each other. It's about a way of being in the world together. There isn't this sort of political awareness or even political identity you have to sort of bring with you into sort of also the characters that are written right today versus sort of. So I think the naive optimism that we all sort of believed in this grand love story. We have all the great rom-coms, the 90s and the early 2000s that you don't really see around anymore. It's a different mood. It's a different zeitgeist in the 2020s.
I was actually thinking about that when you said it, because romantic comedies or spoof movies, for example. So I think by the end of the 90s, Something About Mary, Shallow Hal, those the Farrelly Brothers movies. Yeah. I'm not so sure if they could be made today with the standards today. It probably could, but it wouldn't be the same thing.
No, it wouldn't be the same thing. And I think it's interesting to think about that we sort of that was the kind of story that we were told, and that's what we wanted to see in storytelling, where I think today everything is sort of dystopian. Yeah. And I remember one of my film professors in film history, when I was in film school, that we haven't talked about yet. Yes, in film school. He talked about how both Bollywood and Nollywood, so the Nigerian film industry also, the different types of stories versus sort of Western cinema. At the point being where the kind of story that was what's favored among sort of the population and what you wanted to see was this idea of just finding a man who treats a woman right. most of the time. So this idea of the utopian story, we're kind of done with that.
Yeah.
Like we've had that. Now we want to look at something else where we can sort of find our way back and finding a purpose with life in the midst of this pessimism, I think, is happening now.
Yeah,
versus
exactly.
sort of back then.
Yeah. No, I find it very interesting as well because, like I said before, it feels like today's society, it's more strict what you can do and what you can't do. And it feels like there's one point of how you're supposed to think about certain relatable subjects. And there's the correct way and there's not the correct way. And me personally, I think it's been showing quite lately in both TV and movies, I would say. I'm having trouble just at the top of the moment here, but I remember when we discussed the idea, we talked about Disney movies. About,
we did. Disney. It's a great example.
And when they do the remakes, the live-action remakes, and what they keep intact from the animated version, and then what they change in the live-action, and I find that very interesting, and that's something that Disney as well has received a lot of criticism for as well.
But it's also interesting, this idea of revisiting old stories and telling them anew.
Yes.
Which is, again, I think because there is this idea that the stories we tell in some way, it's just a personal opinion, but they have to educate somehow.
Yeah.
Like the characters that we today have, they need to be complex. There needs to be all these things that they worry about, like this idea of personal development, identity development, that you perhaps did not see the same. And I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing that we are revisiting these stories. But it's interesting that it's become sort of the norm of doing that. We could even take Sex and the City as an example. You think about how emblematic that was for just 4 girls out in the town, and now there's a new remake.
Yeah.
The same characters, but very different stories to sort of reflect better the world we live in.
Yeah.
But so there is this, I find it fascinating, this idea that how entertainment, it's always been, I guess, kind of educational. You also like social realism and all this stuff. But now you have to really look to find just a feature or a TV show that is just this happy-go-lucky kind of thing. Like we have few sitcoms around, but it's also very marginalized and very...
Exactly. Yeah. So it feels like it's an era that's not at all present at the same...
Yeah, exactly.
Like you said, exactly with sitcoms, I think I can just name on my fingers a couple of ones that are on...
Yeah, newer, And The Big Bang.
And then when I remember growing up, especially during the 80s and the 90s, it was huge with sitcoms. It's like you mentioned Friends earlier. That was in my opinion, one of the best, but also I think the biggest one internationally. Everybody was talking about Friends, and especially meeting up with friends in school the day after. Oh, did you watch the latest episode of Friends? Chandler did this, Monica did this. But I can miss that time. I think we don't experience that the same way. That goes for all kinds of TV series. That I think we're like having Netflix at first and other streaming services when they released all of the episodes at once. Yeah. Now they're gradually going to another episode each week, obviously for economic reasons, but also thinking like, okay, then you have time to wait for it, and you have expectations for it, and then, but if it's a really popular series, I remember last one was like the House of Dragons, I think. We were talking about it at work the day after. Was oh my God, this happened. What did you think about that? And I remember series like Breaking Bad and those kinds of series also we talked a lot about. So. And I can miss that. That feels like that was a part of the time back then as well.
Flow TV was great.
Yeah.
Like you never knew what was on.
No.
Like you sat with your family and you actually watched a movie together. And I think that's the whole individualization of consuming entertainment that way. It's you go to like your room like a family these days. I can imagine like you all have 4 different shows that you watch.
Yeah, you do watch it on the phones.
Yeah,
and
somebody
iPads,
watches on the phone. Somebody's on the iPad. Another one have it on the TV.
Yeah.
So it's...
I agree.
Yeah, but it's interesting that you said that they've started to go back to like 1 episode a week. Sort of realizing perhaps in the midst of all this that they're just producing it and just getting it out there and you then binge the whole thing. That perhaps also sort of a reflection of maybe not nostalgia, but maybe going back to how like building the hype up around an episode a week. Yeah,
exactly. But speaking about nostalgia, I was thinking about the first episode I did of the podcast and like we talked about, for obvious reasons, if we have Disney as an example, they have the movie that was animated, and then they're now trying to remake them as live action movies, and applying the nostalgic feel to it, and especially people that grew up with it. But then it feels like when they're doing the remakes and then changes are being made as well, that the people that they're applying the nostalgic vibes to don't appreciate that, or maybe they feel like, oh, this is not how I remember it, and this is not how I envisioned it as a live action, and I find that also very interesting. And
also sort of like it's kind of a question of whether a story is I don't know how to say it, but like, is it set in that time? Does it belong to a certain mood? To a certain zeitgeist, something in society that's where it belongs. So that pulls into question the idea of remaking anything, you know, because obviously they have the opportunity to make this story better, or perhaps we're more in line with the way society is today, which is always a good thing. But what happens in that transition is also that, you know, because, I grew up with Disney. And many sort of childhood memories was always there was film around, like the first kind of strong woman that could do things on her own. Not that Disney they have not always been great at that. But it's but I enjoyed many of the live action Disney movies. But it's interesting that's sort of a thing that you have to think about, I think, in the industry, that you can't just go about doing this happy-go-lucky film anymore. Yeah.
But it's still also interesting what you just pointed out. It feels like when we're talking about the term zeitgeist, it's like the spirit of the time.
Yeah.
And if you could apply it to today's standard, today, what people want and what people try to apply to in the storytelling. So do you have any thoughts about that?
No, I think if we really draw it up like black and white in that sense, if you think about like sort of naive optimism versus sort of the pessimism today, that sort of seeps, it's just there, like in all kinds of stories that we consume. I mean, entertainment. I don't know how it would go down if you like make that kind of story. I think people would think you were irresponsible, sort of like how, you know, these characters, they need to show something, they need to have something at heart, they have to show this complexity. And all of them, and I think it also sort of, no value judgment whatsoever, but I think it also limits storytelling a little bit. So used to work in the film industry, can't say where, but somewhere in Denmark for an agency. And one of the sort of first experiences I had with this about the kind of characters that were written. So when we got script in the door and we had to read the scripts and we had to figure out what of our actors would like this, and then they would self-tape for these kinds of scripts coming in. But always when you got sort of the casting call from places around the world, it would always be that we are casting for inclusivity, we are casting for all kinds of people. So they really, if you had a script that was very narrow in the way you had that character written, so sort of bodily features, what the person should look like, where they should be from, they're trying to take that away and make it just a story so that anyone you cast for that role can play that role. And I think that's a new thing, that the industry itself is calling for inclusivity in that way. And not necessarily that it limits storytelling, but I just thought it was very fascinating, the way that we're kind of talking about sort of macro stories at this point that anybody can sort of tap into. But I think something along, when this happens, we also have to think about representation, because I think there's the other side of the coin, is that if anybody can just play these stories, are we telling the right stories? Exactly. From people the stories that need to be told. So it's fascinating in that sense that you couldn't pull in actors who would look like this character because you really weren't told sort of physically how this person should look like. At least they tried not to for sort of the big places around the world when you got those scripts.
No, absolutely. But I would also say that reflects our time as well now, like you said, representation, because it feels like my impression is like an actor, male or female, has the ability to, if it's a really good actor, they can go into a role and really nail it, and it can become whatever character, whatever it could be a timepiece. It can be set whatever, fantasy, sci-fi, whatever. But now it feels like if it's a certain written character, you have to have a person that represents that as well. That you don't just act it; you have to be it as well.
No, that's absolutely true.
And I think it's just an impression of mine. As it become more common, it can be race related. It can be sexuality. So if you have a character that's gay, it has to be a gay actor. And it's like, okay, I can understand that, but at the same time, does that mean that the actors that are not gay, that they are not qualified to play that part?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So that's definitely right, that there are stories that need to be told, and there is this push, I think, for authenticity.
Yeah.
And, you have to really represent, and the people playing these roles should be the people who have this lived experience. But then if you think about this sort of other sort of like more normal stories, that sort of like anybody could kind of play. This is where you get this idea that we have to go away from casting a certain type of person and telling the same kind of stories. The sort of majority stories could be told by whoever. I think that's an interesting sort of push from the industry.
Because I remember a movie I grew up with that I still think is one of the funniest movies I've ever seen. It's The Birdcage with Robin Williams. And I'm just thinking that if it were today, I'm not so sure that he would be cast. If it had been today. But doing such a great character, such great acting, and then with other casts as members as well, just being awesome together, and and he got praised for his performance as well, and all of the other people as well. So, but it's very interesting to see how it would have acted out today. Yeah. With the casting, for example, the casting process. What would be their recommendation? What would be their qualifications? And I'm thinking that you have maybe more experience of that from your past. But I was thinking that it would be interesting to see how might have changed from the 90s, 2000 until today.
That would have been really, obviously I'm not that old. So
no,
of
course,
but I know today. So it was just, but even me going into the industry, not knowing these things, and especially being like a hobby screenwriter myself, it's always difficult because you might have a story you want to tell, but you also risk that you are not the person allowed to tell this story. Yeah. Right? And then you need to make sure that if you're writing a TV show or anything and you have your main characters, they all have to sort of represent something. They all have to be very diligently written in terms of their political identity and sort of talking about the environment. And there has to be all these things that they bring in to this art that you create or the story that you create. But is it really then, can I do that? Can I then represent anything that isn't me? Right? So, and here it's difficult. It's not it's not a task that we can't figure out, but it places an incredible amount of awareness on.
You're right.
On the writers as well.
Because thinking back, like if you look at film history, how things have progressed and changed. I would say for the better in many cases. Going back, like if you go to the beginning of the 20th century, it was like Birth of a Nation. It's like this classic, and how it represented Black people, for example, and the Ku Klux Klan, and how that's changed. And then you fast forward, and this is just an example, but having like John Wayne playing Genghis Khan, for example, you have this Western icon then suddenly playing an Asian character. It's like, I think I would say that we have moved on, and we have.
We're playing around with genres as well, playing around with testing the limits. If you take something as the international phenomenon that is Bridgerton on Netflix, playing around with sort of stereotypes and how you perhaps would perceive that story should be told, and because it's a period piece, we have these ideas about how people should look and who should be in the cast, but they completely just take the rug from under your table and just flip everything around, which is very refreshing in a way, but I don't think we would have seen those stories just 20 years ago. No. Or seeing, that is sort of one of the messages. Again, movies have to have some kind of message.
Exactly.
Like something we learn from, something we can identify with, or we can challenge or make us more aware, raising sensitivity, all these kinds of things, which I think is It's really difficult. I mean, I've tried. If you just have like one of those nights you just want to watch something that in one ear, out the next, it's very difficult if you don't want to return to sort of Friends.
Oh, exactly.
Or One Tree Hill or whatever.
No, you're absolutely right. But I remember us talking also about like when we were growing up, being 80s, even 90s, and stuff, about for example, high school movies. That feels like that was so huge at one point. The comedies, the dramas as well. It felt like that was an entire genre in itself. My impression is that doesn't exist the same way. I mean, there's still movies being made, but there's not that popularity around.
No, I think that's absolutely true. And if you think about Mean Girls, Tina Fey, it's just such a cult movie that she made right there. But the kind of big names in the industry are not doing these kinds of movies anymore. So you still get them. Like you have these Hallmark awful Christmas movies. Like where it's like this woman in town, like she goes home and there's like a lumberjack. He's like so hot and he lives out in like God knows where. Like this is, I mean, yes, they're still there, but you don't see the big names in the industry doing these kinds of movies anymore. But that was it was such a thing to do or to write a really nice rom-com. Notting Hill, for example, or You've Got Mail, all these things with like big names. You still have these kind of rom-coms now, but it's for the B-ranked or B-listed actors most of the time.
Maybe a B-listed, but more maybe up-and-coming actors as well. But like you said, not the A-list actors that are...
No, absolutely not. So that's just...
But speaking of Mean Girls, have you seen the remake of
I have seen the remake.
Yeah? How did that fare against the original one, you would say?
Well, maybe I am getting a little old. So I'm like, a little nostalgic.
Come on.
Nothing compares to that one, but I understand why they did it. But maybe it's also a challenge, perhaps, that because we stream everything and everything is still available to us. So you could think about if it is that really a movie we want to show young girls today? Probably not. And they still, the original Mean Girls. Yeah. If you think about sort of body imaging, and sort of just a lot of issues with that movie. And perhaps they have to do it because we do have streaming services now, so people have access to it. It's not that they do the VHS or the DVD anymore. So maybe perhaps that is why that they do all these remakes.
For our younger viewers or listeners, VHS was the cassette tape, video home system, and then it also was DVDs, digital versatile disc.
So. And then Blu-ray. That was sick.
That was sick.
I remember we had to watch the movie back.
Yeah, like if you rented a movie, you have to rewind it every time. We're going to back.
You could go to Blockbuster and rent movies. There was like a family thing. You could get 3 movies. That was it for the weekend, and you had to decide at least on one of them that everybody could watch. And then me and my sister could find some other, like a Disney film or whatever we wanted to bring home. That was just a different time.
Yeah, it's a different time. But as you say, we are so lucky in many ways that we have this enormous access now to so much entertainment. So, but then at the same time, it's started kind of might be, I don't know how to put it, maybe for our time as well. Now it's certainly when we have this huge library, it suddenly becomes more tricky for us to choose something to watch as well.
And it's, at an unprecedented speed, mass production of things. And you're just overwhelmed. You just don't know where to start, and you don't know what is really a good story here. Where can I find something that really touches me? And it's that kind of like art experience, which I think more so there is this disconnect or discrepancy between the TV industry, sort of just like hit show after hit show and just like mass produced, and then it's become more niche. I think a little bit, sort of like the Oscars, like that kind of like art. The indie scene is sort of what's, in my opinion, sort of on the rise. That's where you go for that kind of experience, for entertainment, or not even entertainment, for like perhaps sort of find like a feeling that you want to get from this kind of movie. You just only watch it once, but it was such an experience where this mass produced is just.
No, it's just very interesting time we live in. But I want to go back very quickly to, we talked about Mean Girls again.
Sorry.
No worries. This is fun.
On Wednesdays, we were pink.
And then we had these 3 movies. And I'm just thinking, I haven't seen the remake yet. I'm planning on doing it, but I was just very curious. Did you notice anything that struck you when you saw it? That if you look back on the original one, the Tina Fey version with Lindsay Lohan, and then the new one, had they changed a lot?
I think for me, it was the change of actors. So what sort of Regina George looked like in the original one, this like tall, beautiful blonde, she's also a tall, beautiful blonde, this one, playing her, but different body type. So I think that's sort of what they really tried to, body positivity about how you look, and sort of that she was cast as the popular girl.
All right.
Not having to be a size 0, as was sort of the...
Okay.
Yeah, so perhaps that's one of the biggest things that they redid.
Yeah. Okay.
I actually don't know who made the new one, to be
me neither.
honest. I don't know.
Yeah, but it's just very curious if, from what we talked about in the beginning of the pod, about if you change certain stuff to fit the narrative of today's zeitgeist.
But isn't it also interesting that you then have to? Is it an educational purpose to go back and remake something like Mean Girls, or are we just not good at storytelling anymore? Do you see my point? Like, do we need to steal? Kind of, okay, well, we'll base it on this. This will be the premise, but we're going to change things a little bit. So it could be that there are just two things happening at the same time, right?
I agree with you.
Because you think if you don't want that kind of movie to be made, why remake it?
Absolutely.
But I think it's part of sort of a larger political movement of sort of changing narratives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Let's go back to you talked about utopias and dystopias. What would you like to talk about there regarding the zeitgeist?
Perhaps that what we're looking for in a story today, I think, if you think about what sort of the big blockbuster movies, and also where is the zeitgeist headed in a way in the industry, it has to be a story that does not deal with the mundaneness of life. It has to be something that's bigger than ourselves all the time. We have to sort of find that purpose in life amidst this world that's falling apart, which is, of course, also a reflection of sort of what's going on in society. But it's just interesting to see that it's most time you can't really find a story that is just. I mean, of course, there are stories about the mundane life, but when we really talk big money, big cash, thinking about where the money is put, it's always about something where the world is falling apart in a way, which is so interesting when you just think about the sort of the Western world and how we produce movies here is sort of not just like a reflection of American society, but sort of we all kind of are digging these stories. Like we all watched The Handmaid's Tale to sort of, we were like, whoa, this is an adoption from Margaret Atwood from the late 70s, early 80s.
Exactly. And there actually was a movie made in the end of the 80s or beginning 90s, I think. And then now, in the current time when they made the series, which is sometimes terrifying watching.
Yeah, and also thinking about why is it a time right now to revisit that?
Yeah.
Right? To sort of make that into a TV show at this point. Yeah.
Any thoughts about that? Or reflections?
I mean, I think it was very scary watching The Handmaid's Tale while Donald Trump was president. I think that was sort of...
I can completely understand that.
That you were just... I think it got us to think about how, how... Not that politics are dangerous, but in a way, how quickly something can turn if we keep forgetting about what happened throughout history. Like this idea of just repeating the same mistakes, or if we push a certain group too much, if we push the patriarchy, especially for me as a woman, this is a potential thing that could potentially happen. So I think it was very scary that it came out that same time that he fucked around in the White House.
Because I remember in a couple of the first episodes how they explain how we end up in this part of time and how things are slowly changing towards this dystopian future.
Yeah.
And that's what I found a bit scary, how some of parts fit the real world here. But then, of course, taking it a step further. But but it was scary how similar some aspects were. So then tapping into that to make it feel more authentic, but also more scary.
Yeah, and thinking about it, it's not something I mean, if you think about just the Hunger Games, when did they come out? 2010? So right after Twilight or something.
Exactly.
Already there, which is also sort of a reflection of the U.S. With the different, they're called factions. I forget whether districts that they live in, and the stuff about going into the capital and sort of immigration to the U.S. and who lives in these different. So it's been going on for some time, but we're kind of it's like we haven't really let it go.
No,
we're still looking for those dystopian stories.
Exactly.
Where we can make sense of this mess of a world, and we perhaps can find something that we're passionate about, or something we can change. It's always about sort of this personal development, finding something you are interested in, passionate about, to go out and sort of change something in the world.
Exactly.
In that way, they become a little bit of educational. It's not just something you just watch and forget about it.
No, exactly. I would say absolutely educational, but this might sound a bit strange, but I can also, at sometimes regarding movies, see the beauty of dystopian futures.
Yeah.
I know it might sound a bit weird, but I'm a huge fan of the Mad Max movies. I've been since I was a child, and during that time it was the fear of atomic war between the United States and Russia, obviously, but and that time. How this was the dystopian future of nuclear holocaust, basically people trying to survive, and now looking forward to today, that we're actually getting a new Mad Max movie set in the same dystopian future in the wasteland, basically. And I find it very interesting and very intriguing that it originated back in the 80s and now still valid today, and still finding new stories set in this world. It's very interesting.
Yeah, because there are both sort of stories that are set in, hitting very close to home, like we talked about the Handmaid's Tale TV series. But then you also have these kinds of, phenomena as Mad Max, which is, I think, perhaps not necessarily the same thing. They share that it's dystopian, but it's not a direct reflection of society.
No, exactly.
Because you can sort of imagine yourself being in that world.
Exactly.
And then you can leave the movie theater and sort of,
Exactly. Maybe seeing how people are in the dystopian future, what remains intact of our humanity and stuff like that.
It's kind of like peeking into the future, figuring out where are we going, how are we, figuring all this out.
Yeah, but but then you also have like the dystopian talking about like The Last of Us.
Yeah. It's very good.
Was the last show I remember being very. I felt both heartfelt, but also felt like, oh wow, this is. Really struck a chord with me, and especially with emotions, and also feeling this feeling of hopelessness. And
also interesting because that's I don't know if it's actually based on a book, but it's a game.
It's a
game. The Last of Us.
Exactly.
So also this idea of why now, making it, and it was also. It was a conscious choice. It probably was, but it was a little bit scary with this fungus thing. The virus. It was right on top of COVID. So again, sort of. Yeah. Why did you choose to produce this now? Yeah. Again, revisiting stories that has already been told.
Exactly. Yeah. So in that point of time, it felt like, was it just how to put it, like a choice, or was it just in the correct time to do this? Like you said, that was going on, and it wasn't the right time to make it. So. No, it's just very interesting. But like you say, with dystopian futures, I think I would say it would be absolutely for an educational purpose. And I know now with the whole AI revolution going on at the moment, then people are referring to, for example, the Terminator movies with Skynet, for example, about this AI being self-aware and then destroys the entire world and replacing it with machines. And,
there is a newer one, I think, 23 or 22, I forget the name right now, which is not great when you're on a podcast to talk about the movie. It's not called...
Who's in it?
It's about AI. It's set, of course, in a dystopian future where sort of the different powers around the world have not been able to agree on how to use AI. So the U.S. has restricted use of AI. But the Asian context, they just call it in the film, so they don't mention any names, has not. So, and it's about sort of how they do military operations and all this stuff. So at one point, it becomes sort of like a capital to have this AI. I forget what it's called. You must have heard about this.
I recognize it as well. We have to link to it.
We'll link to it. Yes. Yeah, but that was sort of. I went to the movies and I saw that, and I thought, oh, okay, so already here we go, sort of now again with AI.
Are you thinking about the creator?
The creator, thank God, thank you.
You're welcome.
The creator, that was the one. Yeah,
I remember that one. Yeah, I really enjoyed that movie.
Yeah.
But it didn't meet up to my personal expectations, I would say. But it was very fascinating. Like you said, this was like a dystopian future as well. That AI took it to the next level and destroyed parts of the world, and how it's evolved to what we see in the movie. And
question sort of where does humanity start and where does it end with these sort of bots that are running around, but also just this sort of fear about if we cannot agree on the world scene about what kind of restrictions we put on this, then you will have these sort of imbalance between countries having this technology. Yeah. And then as in the creator, they use it for military purposes, right? So they send out AI bots instead of people.
What I liked about that movie was the maybe existential questions. That what does it mean to be human? Yeah. I got flashbacks from one of my all-time favorites, Blade Runner, as well. Of course, surprise. No, but about them dealing with what does it mean to be human. And then you have the androids there, the replicants like they talk about in Blade Runner. And now here you have robots with an AI that has been evolving and making them more human-like. And the thought is a bit scary, but at the same time, it feels like, well, that's a question we actually have to ask ourselves. Where do we draw the line? Where there's what's okay and what's not okay? Yeah. And how that definitely represents the time at now, especially talking about AI. It's been, I mean, everybody's talking about AI. And if it's a good thing about AI, the bad things about AI, and how if it will replace us, will it be just like an extra tool for us to work with on the side? I mean, so it evokes lots of questions and feelings, I can guess. So, especially if people are getting afraid that workplaces will be changed and maybe that people won't be necessary the same way. So it's like, some of the dystopian futures are actually coming more and more closer.
Yeah, I think so. So there's also, I mean, we can also talk about fantasy.
Yeah.
How that is just I mean, you're more of a film nerd than I am. But I would think,
what do you mean?
What do you mean? I would think that now that connecting that to also looking for stories where it needs to be so removed in a way from sort of this mundane storytelling that people are just in for the fantasy, like both in TV show production, but also in features. Yeah. Which is, perhaps also something we saw in the 2010s and it continuing to sort of be a thing.
Exactly.
And more mainstream, I would also think, in terms of sort of thinking back. I don't know if it's perhaps more mainstream now for just non-film nerds to, of course, like watch Star Wars, for example. Wouldn't you say? Like, in terms of like when you were younger, so it was a special breed of people. Who watch Star Wars. Yeah.
No, I actually agree with you on that. It feels like it's more okay. It feels like, especially, I remember growing up, like being a nerd or being a geek was very negative term to somebody, that it was a small amount of, but now when you mentioned Big Bang Theory earlier here, and just feeling that now it's okay to be, now it's actually cool to be.
Yeah, so going from sort of a niche, and that also says something about sort of, if we went back to Zeitgeist, about it becomes a mainstream phenomenon all of a sudden. Yeah. To listen and see these stories unfold, fantasy and sci-fi and all these things that perhaps were more on the back burner, and not in a back burner in the sense that I know how popular it was, but in sort of larger society of what does that popular culture look like? That was perhaps sort of a niche, which is sort of finding its way in. Yeah.
No, I agree with you. Yeah. So, but just on top of your mind, do you think there's like a dystopian movie that you feel like when it was made, looking at today, that you think it's relatable now?
What do you mean?
The content of the movie, for example, if you have a dystopian future, we talk about the time it was made, and then how accurate things are maybe now
I don't
in
know
the
if
future.
I can. I mean, there is my favorite movie of all time, The Arrival.
Okay.
But obviously, because I'm a linguist,
Yeah.
so I have to like that movie. But not that I don't think we are close to getting in contact with aliens. Who knows?
No,
But
yeah,
I think that was
that's
sort
an
of
interesting choice. I really like that movie as well. Like you said, being a linguist, I mean, we're just coming up with this idea, a potential first contact with an alien race, and then learning how to communicate with them.
Yeah.
I find that very, very fascinating as well.
And also because it really does incorporate an actual theory of linguistic relativity, which is sort of this idea we think in time. So how is time sort of conceptualized in our minds? And that is just, it was a masterpiece, I think.
Mind-blowing.
Yeah.
I totally agree with you. So, yeah, no, that's a good thing. So, I mean, there's many of the dystopian movies, favorites of mine, for example. I really love, for example, like Escape from New York, those kinds of movies as well. And I don't know.
We're entering territory. When was that from?
No, but I remember just at the time, it was just the idea, the crime rate in the United States goes up as large as it did, and they turn New York City, the Manhattan Island, to a large prison.
Oh,
and just coming up with that idea in the time, not that it's going to happen now, but just the idea of putting up walls up in larger cities as well, and this idea, because that could terrify the shit out of me. And then looking at, like you said, you mentioned Trump earlier, putting up walls and keeping people from getting in and out, and there's some parts of maybe dystopian movies that can still relate and still be in your unconscious mind thinking, oh, I remember seeing something like this. I mean, it might be a bit far-fetched, but I'm just thinking like in the general how to put it, the general not view of it, but the general anyway, but I'm just thinking that it's a bit scary. How
generally,
how stuff that you can have watched. We talked like AI, atomic destruction, and those kinds of stuff, plagues, viruses, and how that still can be a part of our unconscious mind when we see stuff that are actually happening now. I remember we talked about dystopian, the movie was Contagion with Matt Damon. They find this virus that goes across the world, and it looks like a flu.
Okay.
And then that movie I remember scared the shit out of me when I watched it a couple of years ago, and then how uncanny it was when COVID came, how it started, and it was the same kind of symptoms as in that movie. And I was like, okay, this is really happening. We've reached a point where this dystopian movie is actually, this is real life now. So how close it came to.
And also that we feel that we want to consume these kind of stories, I also think is interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, but just thinking about if I were to ask sort of my parents in the late 90s, like what kind of entertainment would you like? Yeah. I don't think they would immediately say something that questions why I'm here. Exactly. Something that it more so. No, it's we watch these stories. You say, oh, this is a love story. This is nice. So that we are looking for that, and that we because they wouldn't produce things if people don't watch it. Obviously, right? No. So this idea that it's reflected in society that we want to take in these kinds of stories. Because it sort of, I don't know, challenges. I don't know what it is, but
it evokes.
Yeah, it
evokes some I would say maybe not excitement, but curiosity about a potential future.
Right. Yeah.
About us.
But isn't it wild that we want to see that? Wouldn't we just say, "Oh, that's too scary," right? Yeah. But we don't really. We are very curious about where it's going.
Absolutely. There might be somebody that might say, well, I don't want to watch it. It doesn't caught my interest in any way. But then there are some of us, including us, I would say, that enjoy seeing that and just being able to experience that. So,
I mean, good luck to those. I mean, it's difficult to find anything that doesn't. So it's like good luck, but it's all over the place. Yeah.
No, you're actually right. So, Sophia, any final thoughts or remarks that you want to share or discuss before we end?
I don't know. Any final remarks? Do you have any final questions?
Any final questions there? Do you have any recommendation, or like a movie that you still have as a favorite that that can be?
Like as I said, I've been out of it because I've been committed to Grey's Anatomy for a good year. So I need to get back to sort of figure out what to do next. Are you thinking in terms of a film or a TV show?
Yeah, a film, TV show, mainly film.
It's been ages since I watched anything good. Let me think while you give your recommendation.
Okay, cool. But it was interesting that you mentioned the creator because it felt very hyped at some point.
Yeah.
But like you said, it also had to do lots with the AI talk going on. And I find it so fascinating looking back at movies earlier and older movies as well, especially when we're talking about the dystopian ones. That was what was going on at the time when some of these movies were made.
Yeah.
And it feels like I mentioned the Mad Max movies, but I was thinking like during the 80s felt like there was so many movies, especially about the dystopian future, that the common narrative was the apocalypse of the like a nuclear disaster.
But also in popular fiction, I'm sure, like in books. Yeah.
And I just found it very fascinating during that time how that was like every story, every action movie in the dystopian future it was always set after the nuclear war or something.
That was sort of the premise. That's where it started. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So now I just find it very interesting looking at what's interesting at that time and then going on. So, yeah.
This is not a recommendation, but this is sort of a movie that will always make me feel good. And I think it wraps it up really well. We started talking about Disney. I think The Lion King will always just hit home for me.
Oh, right.
That's not sort of an art film, but I can watch that from now on till the ends of time.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Is it the animated one?
The animated one.
Yeah.
But
it's so good.
It's just, yeah.
Simba.
Yeah. No, we can't now talk about Mufasa dying because then I will start crying. But it's such a good. It's cute, and it's just a shame in a way that
I agree.
kids today don't really watch this kind of stuff.
Yeah, they should.
They should watch their YouTube and their shorts, whatever. Yeah.
But this has been so much fun. It feels like we could talk about this for
we probably
hours
could.
And hours.
We have to wrap it up.
I think so too.
Yeah.
But you're most welcome to come back soon, and maybe we can continue discussing it.
Season 2.
Season 2.
Yeah.
Oh yes.
Yes.
It's a season 2.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Likewise.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. If you enjoyed listening to the podcast, please remember to click like and subscribe. It helps me with the channel and it also helps me create more content. Thank you.